Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Kelly Wiley. I'm a manager within the Inclusion Collaborative here at the County Office of Ed. And it's my pleasure to welcome on behalf of California One, Colleen Toomey and Dr. Darlene Sampson. They're joining us from WEAC, which is the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center.
Yes.
They're out of Colorado. I had to look that up. It's just always WEAC.
Yep. We'll talk more about what that means.
Thank you. So Dr. Darlene Sampson comes to us as a licensed clinical social worker with a master's degree in social work and a PhD in educational leadership with an emphasis on culturally responsive pedagogy. And Colleen comes to us, she's totally local via UC Santa Cruz, where she received her bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of Vermont. She's worked in multiple capacities in higher education as well as K-12. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you both on behalf of California One as we dive into the impact of equity, the intersectionality, and disproportionality. Easy for me to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. All right. So is this thing, are we good? Yeah. Okay. Good morning. My name is Colleen Toomey. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. Very happy to be here. Grew up the road in Oakland, so always happy to come out to the Bay Area. So Dr. Sampson and I are pleased to be here to spend this morning with you talking about these tough topics. So we have a couple hours to dive in, and we're going to give you lots of resources and explain a little bit more about what we do. But our office got connected with Kathy Wall and the Inclusion Collaborative last spring, and so we were out for the Inclusion Collaborative Conference in October, and really happy to be here today leading this institute. So we're going to talk a little bit first about who we are, and kind of where we come from, why we do this work, and we're going to share, each of us are going to share a family saying that is kind of lore in our family. So grew up in Oakland. While that's a very diverse community, I lived in a pretty insular Catholic community. So I was at the same Catholic school for 9 years, and then a Catholic high school for 4 years. And so then I kind of burst that bubble and went down to UC Santa Cruz, where I started to really kind of process and learn a lot about what it meant to be white, what it meant to hold privilege in society, and really be challenged on a lot of the things I thought I understood. And I'm really grateful for my time there and learning a lot about these ideas of social justice and equity, and really kind of set me on this trajectory of working in education and doing equity work from a lot of points of privilege. And so I grew up pretty securely middle class, and with this religious privilege of being Catholic, and that really shaped a lot of who I am. And I've had to and continue to do a lot of unlearning of some of those things that I've been taught, and kind of relearning and re-engaging in these issues. And it is lifelong work, and so that's how I see it. I've been in Colorado for 10 years in a lot of different capacities in higher ed, and been working at our center, and we'll explain what the WEAC does in a few minutes here, but been working at our center for the last year, and we get to go out and do a lot of trainings like this, do a lot of work with schools and districts and county offices around equity and civil rights. And so I see this work as urgent and just always ongoing, like I said. And so again, I'm coming into the work from a lot of points of privilege, and so straight, white, cisgender, able-bodied, physically. So I have a lot of areas that I approach this work from. And so realizing, for me, one of my big commitments is to bring other white folks into this work and have these conversations, and to really dive deep into what it means to hold these identities. So a family saying that I often come back to is when I was learning how to drive. And I was the oldest kid, and my dad was a little more nervous, I think, than I was, that I was driving, and he would always yell at me to not be afraid of the middle of the road as I was learning how to drive. And I kind of see that as, not being afraid to, to see the path forward. And, it's still something we say in my family when I'm with my siblings. We kind of laugh and still say those things. So just that ongoing learning and not being afraid to see the full road as we're driving forward. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Sampson to introduce herself. Yeah.
So I'm Darlene Sampson, and I am from a small town called Pueblo, Colorado. Has anybody ever heard of it? What? It used to be where you get consumer magazines and stuff like that, but everything's technology now. So I grew up, my father was a pastor in a Pentecostal church. My mother was a missionary. I'm the youngest of 10, totally loved my birth order. I got everything, enjoyed everything, and was nurtured by my other siblings. And I want to say that I'm a social worker, but I also am an educator. So I call myself a social work educator because I have my PhD is in educational leadership with an emphasis on curricular augmentation for culturally responsive teaching. But my social work helps me to understand how people are thinking, what they need, what support, and how to bridge the two together as we do this work. The equity work is hard. Our nation right now is challenged. We have a lot of, as we travel all over, we see so much. There's so many issues around schools and what they're trying to do. And they're just a microcosm of what's happening in the world. So my Pentecostal upbringing really gave me the spirituality, but also the moral values and integrity. But it also provided me with a love of service and social justice. So that's kind of where I came from. And my parents had so many sayings, it would take me a whole couple weeks to talk about them. But one thing I remember in particular was my mother saying to me, if you can look up, you can get up. And so a part of what that was is whatever happens to you, you can be able to pull yourself up out of it based on education, the importance of where we're going as a family. Family is very, very important to us. So she never worried about what would happen to me in terms of as I walk this earth as a Black woman. She said rejection is protection. So if you get pushed away, and if someone decides they don't want to accept your greatness, it's preparing you for another space. So those are the kinds of things I heard early on about who I was and how important it was for me to keep pushing. As I look up, I can then get up. So it's really important. We're going to talk to you a little bit about your sayings as well. But it's important for us to talk about who we are so you know who we are. We're not just stepping into California without the experiences of our own work, but also we value what you bring to the space and what you bring in terms of your own lens as well.
Thank you. So as you heard, a little snapshot of who we are and why we do this work, did you hear any commonalities or did you hear any overlap between our two stories? We hold a lot of different identities, but there are some similarities. Did anybody hear anything? Yeah, and we should use the mic, right, when folks are speaking? Yeah. Yeah, can you say that one more time?
Family.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Thanks.
Commitment to service.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Christian-based religion.
Yeah, both of us have that. So when we think about overlap and what we want you to do at your table, I know some of you probably know each other well, some of you may not know each other, but to kind of do what we just did at your table for a few minutes, but to also think about how you relate to, how does this relate, how does storytelling relate to these concepts of intersectionality and data, right? What that means in the scope of our work. So what we want you to do is just take a couple minutes, introduce yourself at your tables, and do the same thing. Where do you come from? Why do you do the work that you do? And what is a family saying that you have? All right, so we're gonna bring it back to the large group. What I like about this exercise is it allows us to share some pieces of ourselves that maybe we don't normally think about as much, and kind of allows us to reflect on where we come from. So along that line, we'd love to hear from a couple folks, just some of the family sayings that came up for you. So does anybody have one they'd like to share? And again, we're going to bring around the mic.
Do you want to share? No? No? Okay.
Anyone have one?
You'll share one?
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
My dad always said, you always worry about the wrong thing.
Okay. Yeah, behind you, Darlene.
Oh.
Thank you.
My grandfather always said I was the creme de la creme, and at the time I didn't really feel that way. But I realized later on that because my grandparents believed in me so much, it kind of made me step up to meet their expectations. So it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, thank you. One more willing to share?
Yes.
Thank you.
I integrated it or internalized it in our dialect, but the English of it is keep on keeping on.
Thank you. Yeah. So creating space for storytelling is really critical in this equity work, and being mindful that these data points we're going to look at later, and the different roles we play in our work, there are people behind the numbers, right, and stories behind the numbers. So working to create some space in that to remember that is critical and crucial in this work. So we're going to transition here, and Dr. Sampson will talk about our office.
So did you know there are equity centers all across the United States? Did you know? Okay. Did everybody know that? Not necessarily? Okay. So we are actually, our funding comes from the Department of Education, the federal government. And there used to be 8 equity centers. There are now 4. And so we are charged with that huge area in the western region. Every equity center has about 5,000 places they're going to. And that's our spaces. And they include Guam, Island of Mariana, Hawaii, Wyoming, California. We're just spread all across these western states. So K through 12 schools can call us and ask us free of charge to come to support them around race, national origin, religion, English language learners, civil rights issues, Title IX. But we also have specialties like culture responsive teaching, trauma, LGBTQ plus supports. So we do a lot of additional work, and schools can call us for free of charge, but at the same time, businesses do call us if they're connected to K through 12 schools. So Colleen and I have a lot of programs where they mentor in schools, particularly to students of color. But it could be any business that's associated with a K through 12 school. So this is a service across the United States, and every state has an equity center, but it may not be in that particular city, but every state has one that provides services and support. So we get reauthorized again. There'll be a new grant coming out in September of 2021. So it could actually be that you are we receive funding again or not. They've been around a long time. We are part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So you cannot get rid of the equity centers, but you could defund them or change the funding. So that's how our services work, and lots of civil rights issues right now. And we also do a lot of bullying, anti-bullying work across all the school districts. Yes. Is this available for the preschool? It's available for, yes. There was a specific focus on ECE early on, but any school that has under the umbrella of race, national origin, religion, any kind of issue or challenge, or they want support, a lot of schools call us because there's Office of Civil Rights complaints. But some call just because they really want to look at some of their data, some of the supports. We look at policies and procedures. We look at the website. We help with policies and statements, procedures. So yes, it's available for early childhood education as well.
And at the end of our session today, we'll give you a link to a Google Drive where we're putting a lot of resources, including our brochure, which has a lot more information, and our website has a lot of information as well. So that's a little overview of what we do. So we travel quite a bit and really enjoy coming out and meeting different folks and seeing what the issues are. And we really do tailor the services to whatever is needed. So some folks will be like, do you have just this canned presentation? And what we're really liking to dig out is what's going on in your school, what's going on in your district that we can help be responsive to and empower the staff to help with that as well. So it's also important as we do equity work to do a land acknowledgement and honor the original owners of the space that we're occupying now. And so I will read this statement. As we gather here today, we honor, acknowledge, and ask you to remember that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homeland of the Ohlone and Tamian nations. We pay our respect and give thanks to these tribal nations and the ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So for us, as we go out into the different parts of the Western US, there are a number of tribes who have occupied the different spaces that we go out and train on. So to name that, to honor them, and to be mindful of that, and to not stop at a land acknowledgement either, to also be thinking what else is needed to honor the traditional owners, the original owners of this land, and what else can we be doing to educate ourselves, to be thinking about our Native and Indigenous populations as we do this equity work. We also, when we were developing this session with Kathy, wanted to think about some learning agreements. So this is our hope for our time today, that we can unpack and understand concepts of bias and intersectionality and evaluate personal tenets around leading for equity. That we can examine disproportional challenges in relationship to data, student learning, and academic success. And we have a few activities we'll guide you through in regards to that. And then thinking about some action items and strategies to infuse equity and culturally responsive practice in your role, whatever that means for you. We know there's a lot of different roles represented here. So being mindful that you need to take what's gonna make sense for you. Where are your spheres of influence? So what we're gonna do now is, as we engage in this work, it's also important to get some collective buy-in from you all. What do you need in this space? What do you need to help you be successful as we navigate some of these challenging conversations? So what do you need for yourself? What do you need from the group? What do you need from us as facilitators as we go through this? Yeah.
Will there be scheduled breaks, or do we just take care of our personal needs as they arise?
So that can be an agreement. We have a limited amount of time. We only have 2 more hours with you all today. So if you need to take a break, we're not scheduling one in this time. So please take what you need for yourself.
Do your thing.
Yeah. What else do folks need?
Short amount of time, so we'll just keep going.
Yeah. Do you have? Okay. Thanks.
To feel safe to ask questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
So here are some typical agreements usually associated with equity work. It's hard and can be intrusive because it goes to the values of who we are. It talks directly about how we think about things, and it might go closer to what you think, but it also might create some discourse. We usually presume positive intentions, which is a higher standard than assuming. It's like, I will go ahead and give people positive regard as we start this work. We give ourselves permission not to know because we're all learners. I learn every time and every place that I go to. So I'm a learner still. Be willing to be uncomfortable. Go ahead and be willing to be uncomfortable now. And just sit with whatever you need to. If there's something that's sort of a challenge, think about it first. And then the first place that you push back on is you first. Then you bring it back to the space to ask about it. But you ask yourself first, why am I thinking or feeling this way? We stay confidential. What's said here stays here. What's learned here leaves here. And then we approach the challenges of our most vulnerable students, our most marginalized populations, from a strength-based perspective. It's really important. And I think you just said we have to create a safe place. Just because I say it doesn't mean it's a safe place. It's a part of all the behavior that goes on all day long. It's like referring back to the agreements when there's a challenge. It's leaving here and still showing a safe place. So it's a part of starting it, is creating a safe place. And we all are uncomfortable with some of these issues, and our key is to challenge them. So how many of you have biases in the room? Bias. So we all have it. And that's kind of like that last bullet, is we will challenge it and pay attention to it and work on recognizing it. So it's okay, as we do this work today, to start, as we're doing this intersectional space, to think about that we all do have uncomfortable thoughts. We all do struggle with certain areas that we need to work on.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
I actually want to add something.
Yeah, of course.
So the idea of a safe space, and thank you for saying that just because you say it is doesn't make it so. I just want to put out there also that spaces like this can feel safer for some than others,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And that we stay cognizant of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Any other thoughts, reactions to this list? Does this feel like, including our shared agreements here, are we okay to agree to these tenets as we move forward? Okay, awesome. So some other disclaimers. As we do our work today, it's important to remember that we may or may not feel uncomfortable. This is called the pedagogy of discomfort. It's very acceptable, very necessary when digging for equity. You may or may not experience anger, fragility, and anxiety as we discuss race, identity, difference, disproportionality, culturally responsive practice. I still get really anxious and nervous leading these kinds of sessions, and I've been doing this work for a long time. And so that's very normal and natural as we navigate these spaces. You may or may not be able to see difference and its challenges and triumphs. You may or may not feel overwhelmed about where to begin. And our goal in this session today is that there is some opportunity to do some reflecting or leaving and thinking about how you might start to implement some of this work. You may or may not see or perceive your trainers before you hear their message. So you may have walked in and seen the two of us and had some perceptions about who we are and what we know and what we do. That's normal. And sometimes we may see or hear someone or not see or hear someone before we hear their message. We have made assumptions about who someone is. And so just being mindful of that, kind of checking ourselves on that. And you may or may not feel you have enough information to begin or to sustain your work. So we ask that you be kind to yourself and know, like we both talked about, the kind of lifelong commitment that this equity work is. And so we don't tie it all up nicely in a bow at 12 noon and call it good, right? It keeps going. So this is a developmental process. We're all on our own journeys, and we all have opportunity to create impact. So, yeah.
Who are the originators of this pedagogy, and what are trusted resources to learn more?
Sure. Do you have that?
I can put that on the website, on the link for you. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I can put it on the link for you. O'Bannon and I don't recall the other name right now, but I can definitely, I'll put that on the link so that you have that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we do have a quick activity to get us started. So what I'm going to pass out now is, this is from the Anti-Defamation League. It's a personal self-assessment of anti-bias behavior. And what I'd like you to do just individually is go through it and answer what makes sense for you today. This is not a comprehensive list of bias, but it's a place to start. So take a few minutes to go through. All right. So does anybody have any thoughts or reactions to the assessment that they want to share? Anything that came up for you as you were filling this out? Again, it's not a complete list by any stretch. You know, I think it would be an ongoing document if it was, but and you know, I know it can bring up a lot of different reactions, so just want to hold some space in case anybody wants to share anything. Okay.
I liked it. I thought it was very useful.
Okay.
And gets you thinking.
Yeah, that's the goal, is that it can get you thinking. And what I like about the document is that it's a good mix of our own personal socialization, so how we were raised, and along with some of the practices that may take place in the workplace or in our home lives. You know, there's a lot of different representations. Yeah. Thanks.
So I'm challenged to think about if I were to put myself in the shoes of like a black trans woman, for example, in which I guess I struggle to think of like, how does this push forward my understanding or my ability to set a goal for myself if I have no power or opportunity really to express sort of prejudice or bias that are that don't automatically serve as methods of like anti-racist or anti-misogyny or what have you.
Sure. So thank you for that. I think that this is one step in identifying, and it's then the sustained commitment that we have to create. And it's not necessarily on that black trans woman to have to do all that work, right? It's on the collective, it's on cisgender people, it's on white people to really engage and empower around that work and bring people into those conversations. So I think we have to be mindful that this isn't, like I said, this is not a be-all, end-all, and so we have to be careful with that too, that people don't just take this and they're like, okay, we named where we are, but it's like the now what, right? And the why. And so this is one step, I think, in starting those conversations and maybe a way for folks to identify, wow, I've never had to think about that before. What does that mean, right?
I guess what I'm asking in
Sure. Thanks.
activities like this just lead to a blank or to an empty space for people of color, for women, for sort of non-majority groups, essentially. And so I think what I often miss is how to use this as someone in those, in one of those shoes.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and I think that's what we're gonna get into with, we wanted to start with the personal work as well, go ahead. To start with the personal as we get into some of the data and the different pieces of how to put this into practice. So this is just step one of our time today. And so I hope I'm answering your question.
Well, I mean, I understand that in terms of the overall process, but I mean specifically this tool. So is there going to be a point where we come back to this and say, well, if you find yourself on like the always side, then
what does that
an
mean?
Elevation of this for you, or like how you pushing this work forward might look like X, Y, or Z.
Right. Yeah, and we can come back to it as we get into the data pieces. I think it will be critical for us to tap back into this. So thank you. Yeah, thank you.
One of the things that I think that, so when I share tools like this, and this might help you as well, I then share the experiences of different people that are not reflected here.
Yeah.
And no tool can reflect that black trans women are the most killed women in the United States right now. So for us to just read a statement, that's an impossibility. Nothing can talk about how Native American children are treated in school. So I have to bring that forward into the conversation as I talk about it. This is general, but what about disproportional spaces, those intersectional spaces that we don't talk about? So it's the experience of it that makes these tools come alive. That you might say, well, I create diversity in my work. And you say, oh, most of the time I do. But then as you start to think about different types of population, kids with special needs, kids who are from foster care, kids who are in the juvenile justice system, that's where it becomes alive, that you create the space for it to think outside of that space, because this won't tell you that. But it gives you the starting point, as Colleen is saying.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. Anybody else have reactions to this, questions? So being mindful, as we identified at the start, we all have bias. And this socialization of how we create understanding of the world starts before people are even born. And this happens, how does this happen? What's the question that gets asked when we find out someone's expecting? Is it a boy or girl? Yeah. So there starts to be meaning making that happens. These gender reveal parties are not inherently about gender. They're about sex. They're about the biology. And so knowing that socialization, that bias starts before people even enter the world. I think that's critical. And then the different things, the different institutions around us help us make meaning and understand the world. And then sometimes that starts to get challenged depending on the spaces we occupy or where we go throughout our lives. And so knowing that these concepts of implicit, so the internal, the things we may not even know we're doing, implicit bias, and then the explicit bias, the more out front things that, policies that get created that automatically other people. So again, this is just a step in our process that we use, and as we continue to dive in, we'll reflect back on this and know too that there's a lot more that makes up this socialization and that makes up who we are and how we make meaning of the world. So we're going to dive into some common language, and I will turn it over.
So we want to start with maybe some concepts that you've already gone over, but we want to be sure that we're anchoring them as we start to talk about intersectionality. So bias and microaggressions, how many of you already have talked about that in different settings and different? Okay, okay. So everybody already knows about bias and microaggressions. We're going to talk about them a little closer in terms of what they look like in policies and in data. Because today we're talking about the intersectionality of data, equity, culture responsive practices. And so microaggressions in schools and in policies are so important for us to pay attention to. Let me go a little ahead into oh, it's up there. So we know what they are, the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults. Whether intentional or unintentional, but they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages. And so we want to think about how do microaggressions, how are they anchored in the data that we're looking at? How are they anchored in how we make choices of who we serve and who we don't serve as well? How are they anchored in our policies and procedures that create a space for disproportionality to be maintained? So on a continuum, disproportionality, if you were to put a continuum from 1 to 10, disproportionality is way over here past the 5. The first thing we usually see is disparities. And you have to decide based on your data in your district where you at in particular areas. So some spaces you might be in disproportionality, which is on the other part of the continuum. Disparities is where we're starting to see some challenges. We haven't paid attention to them, and then they move into disproportionality. So I made a whole chart of some of the ways that microaggressions are embedded into schools and classrooms. But I want you, because you're not working in classrooms, to think about what does it look like in policy? What does it look like in our data sessions? I've been in data digs where people couldn't talk about who they're really talking about. They couldn't label who they're really talking about. Or they felt uncomfortable to say, I think people are afraid of Latino boys. And so we got to talk about that. Some hard conversations often happen inside ourselves or with our peer who we know is our intellectual peep, and we could talk to them. But to say it in a whole group, what happens when you say? I think we need to talk about the fact that children with disabilities are not receiving the same level of services. So as we think about that, I've just given you some ground thinking about what happens in classroom. What happens when in policy and in your data that you see microaggressions, how they rise up and people don't talk about them? So just give you a second to think about that, and we'll just have a few share outs. What does it look like? These disparities and the disproportionality, because they're both different areas in policy and in your data. Okay, can we come back together? And I want to just, some people were asking, how does this relate to policy? Is everybody clear about how this relates to policy? Was it a stretch? Was it kind of difficult to? Okay, so let me just give you an example, and then I want to see what examples you might have. If you pick number 1, failing to learn to pronounce or continuing to mispronounce the names of students after they have corrected you. Anybody have a sense about how that's related to policy? Yes.
Okay, so I'm making a stretch here.
Okay.
So let's say there is a student who was born male but identifies as female, and they've asked more than one time to be called by a different name. Thank you. And the educator or administrator refused to do that. Or on the paperwork that they fill out for school or receive from school, they, their identity is not reflected on the paperwork.
That could be. I think it's on the list as well. I have it on the list as well. So number one could be about a lot of things. So we bring in new educators all the time, or we have our educators who are seasoned, but the onboarding of our new educators does not include how to engage, how to be culturally appropriate, how to work from a cultural standpoint of humility. We don't onboard them for culture responsive teaching. We don't have curriculum that is culture responsive. Our policies are not aligned with what is the real world. The students of color and difference are the global majority now. They're not the minority. They're the global majority. And so we're not ready often in terms of demographics, changes in communities. We have still networks that are anchored in antiquated practices. And so what happens is that we are not ready to understand and be ready for the new cultural groups, the linguistic groups. So this is a part of how you train your educators, how you support them in being ready. We see many disparities just based on how kids show up. They don't leave their culture at the door. They walk into the school in their glory, in their culture. It either is sanctioned, validated, and empathized with and cared about, or it's pushed down and the expectation is they assimilate. And so that's a policy statement. When we say you work for this county, the expectation is everybody will have training and support and ongoing intervention and classroom, whatever it is, classroom support. That's how policy creates disparities. And so these are the challenges. So these are the result of lack of policies, intervention, training, support, understanding, just helping our educators to come all the way over into the space that they need to. Did you think of others in your table groups of how does this get manifested in data or policy? There's a lot of examples here, and they're often all connected to policies. Yes. Let me get this to you.
So number 12, we talked a lot, quite a bit, and that intentionally or not, that teachers, policymakers, whichever lens you want to look at it, will take upon themselves to project what it should be from one and then make the one the all.
In some spaces, that's called the cultural racial tax. And have you heard of that before? And that's where I would be in a building, and I was the social worker for the building, and a student, maybe an African-American student, is having a challenge. You're like, go get Darlene. She can handle it. As opposed to everybody increasing their skill set. Everybody know how to deal with every child. Or I'm your support. But just because I'm black doesn't mean necessarily, could mean, because we know that just even having a couple black teachers in classes and schools helps students, and Latino, well, they found that as well in the study. But what about the fact that we all have to increase our skill set? And that causes great racial fatigue to the individuals who are constantly asked to meet that need. And it happens with our paras around maybe language or behavior. Go get them. They can handle it. And so we have to be aware that it's all kinds of things. So where's our policy in terms of the numbers that we need, the funding that needs to occur, that everybody gets training on how to de-escalate, how do you step into spaces that are culturally different for other people. And so that's how the policy creates disproportionality. And then our kids bring their styles, how they talk, how they walk. We know that just the movement of certain boys creates bias. Just movement studies. Dr. Levon Neal did a lot of movement studies. The swag, the way you come into the room. Someone might say, now I'm like, he got great swag, I love that. But somebody else is like, he's gonna go to jail. Look how bad he is. So we have to understand that just these kinds of things create when we don't have training and support and work on ourselves and step into our own spaces that are different. That's how it gets embedded in policy. Was there any others before we move on? Okay.
All right. So building on this is this concept that we've talked about already, and I'm sure many folks are familiar with, is this idea of intersectionality. And this was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s around her lived experience as a Black woman. And this TED Talk that is linked here, it's called The Urgency of Intersectionality. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the sound going this morning, but the first 4 minutes of that really speak to what she's trying to highlight. And so she asks the room to stand and then to sit down once they hear a name they haven't heard before. And she lists 4 names of Black men who were shot and killed by police. And almost the entire room stays standing. And then she names 4 Black women who were shot and killed by police. And almost the entire room sits down. So this idea of whose stories get told, who gets elevated, who doesn't. And so she was really focusing, again, on her lived experience as a Black woman and those intersections, that sometimes her Blackness was upheld and sometimes her womanness was upheld, but often not both were considered. And when we talk about intersectionality, it's about all of it, right? That we're not just one facet of who we are. We are very complex people, and all of these identities that are listed here, heritage, race, age, religion, gender identity, gender expression, language, history, military, veteran status, all these pieces that make us who we are, we're not just one aspect of that, right? All of those things matter and are of importance. And sometimes they may be more salient than others, right? This is also not a comprehensive list. There are a lot of our values, our beliefs, our upbringing, our family status, all these things matter. And so as we do this work, taking these intersectional lenses, especially as we start to dig for data and think about our own bias, what else is missing? Whose stories aren't getting told and upheld? Why might that be, right? And a lot of times that comes back to some of the bias, some of our own personal socialization, how we make meaning and understand the world is usually more internal, right? And so it can leave out lots of identities of people. So this intersectionality concept is critical as we move forward. So that link to the TED Talk will be in the Google Drive. I'm sorry that we couldn't show that to you this morning. But just being mindful that these concepts are best understood as overlapping, okay? Questions or thoughts on this? So what we'd like you to do at your table is to just pick one of these or 2 of these questions. What does disproportionality look like at your school or district? What are the implications for communities, families, students, and educators? What are some of the factors that have been considered to better understand disproportionality? What's happening right now? And where are some of the barriers you observe that schools, families face as their students go through the system? And then if you were to focus on one thing to change, what would that be? So go ahead and take just a couple minutes, pick 1 or 2 of those questions as a table and dive in. And then we're going to get into our data sets here. So we'd love to hear from a couple of tables what question you looked at, what some of your thought process was. Is anybody willing to share what they grappled with these questions? I know there's lots of different positions in the room too, so it'll be interesting to hear. Yeah, thanks. If you can share kind of what frame you're coming from as well.
So we were thinking about disproportionality in terms of groups that are sent out of their schools or out of their
Sure.
districts.
Sure.
And we were talking about the implications when we talked about messaging around othering and belonging. And in terms of factors, we went to looking at history and policies on like a county level, you know, on a larger scale, and how historical events have contributed to certain economic realities.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah. Hang on. Thank you.
Allow intra-district or inter-district transfers.
Yeah.
And kind of what message that sends and what the result of that can be, instead of addressing why people are running from something and towards something else.
Right, right. Thank you. Thanks.
Just as an example, I was in a school district just yesterday, and we were looking at the foster youth suspensions. And so disproportionality looks like you have 21 students suspended in that district who are foster youth. And within that, in a school district that has maybe 3% African American students, you have 28% of those students being suspended who are foster youth and African American and male.
Right.
In that demographic.
Right.
So that's what disproportionality
Yes, and a good example of some of the intersectionality that we have to be mindful of as we look at this data as well. So thank you all for these.
My frustration with that, because we were speaking a little bit of that, is that we've known for decades now, and it's more, what are we doing?
Right.
Not that we're going to solve it tomorrow.
Sure.
Noon,
Right.
But I feel like in the past, in master's classes, we spend so much energy, right? There's so many research papers showing, right, suspension rates for brown and black students.
Right.
And now it's like, okay, what's the next step?
Right.
It's been proven.
Yeah, we know it exists. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
I think for me, it's who in these questions is not represented.
Right.
Because there are groups of students, to your point, where you're talking about an African American transgender, right, who are not represented in any of the data that we collect. So we're not even thinking about groups of people. They're not even on our radar in terms of looking at the data or collecting data or having meaning for folks that probably have the least amount of voice of all.
Absolutely. Yeah. What does it mean that there are not numbers, there's not statistical significance in terms of some of these populations of people and what that means? And we just don't do anything, right? Because we can't. I don't know these are bigger questions.
I just wanted to point out that the citation here for ADL, this is coming out now, but the citation is from 1978. So, this has been, we've been working on this for a long time. And so if we don't change the systems and have much deeper understanding of the systems and then the actions we can take to affect change around that, we will continue to have these same conversations.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. All right, thank you all.
Okay.
Do that.
So we're going to go over disproportionality a little closer, and if you need to just stand up or take a break or walk around the room, it's perfectly fine, because we're trying to stay on time because we just have a little bit of time today. So you've probably seen this before. You know the definition of disproportionality? The inappropriate overrepresentation, underrepresentation, and over-identification of racial ethnic minority children in various settings, systems, and institutions. It could be anywhere, child welfare, it's in education. The disproportionality is often most evident in relationship to race, gender, socioeconomic status, or other cultural factors. So there's a definition. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how to go closer to, like the foster care youth. We know that because there are ways to go closer. Would you say that you are data rich, data struggling, or data socioeconomically struggling. Data rich, would you say? Can you pull every single thing you need to? So, no, yes. Some people say yes and some people say no. So when we look at disproportionality, we have to go closer than we ever have before. And on top of that, have some really serious conversations. It's not just pulling the data and saying, oh, we found. It is a very structured and systemic way of doing the data. And when we do data digs, I was telling Colleen, it's a whole day when I do that. It is not. We take the data, we're done with at the end of the day, we have a proposed plan. So with our being done at 12 o'clock, that's not going to happen, but I'm going to talk with you about how we can get to some of those spaces. So we have to look at data several different ways. So these are two of the ways that we look at data in disproportionality. You have two ways of looking at it. There are several more, but these are the main ones, the absolute and the baseline. So the absolute is the comparison of the proportion of the group's representation in the school population. It could be about discipline, but it could be about other kinds of things. If they're being over-identified, if they're not in honors programs, if there's no cohort to help students with going to advanced classes and staying there, because we know that children of color difference want to be with someone who's like them. It could also be about kids with mental health needs, and our budget doesn't even reflect what the need is in the school. We put it somewhere else. So example of the absolute proportion is what proportion of Latinos in the school have received out-of-school suspensions. So we're looking at the proportion to their number in the school. And I always tell school districts to try to do both in addition to the intersectional space. The baseline says, look at the percentage of groups of students in the school compared to the percentage of groups of students in that category. It could be children with special education needs, kids in foster care, kids who are in adjudicated delinquent in systems. So the example is if African American students receive 30% of out-of-school suspensions, they only compose 15%. That's disproportionality. I will go places where sometimes educators say, well, we have 85% Latino students and we have 85% Latino students being suspended. Well, but that's just proportionate to the population. Well, we still don't want 85% of students suspended. But I will sometimes hear that when I go places. I'm like, no. We want them no more than 4%. That's the civil rights standards of their population. So we don't want to say, oh, well, hey, it's proportionate. It's the amount that they are in the schools. So we've suspended every one of them. We've suspended all of them. So we don't want that. Yeah. Yes. So we get that. I'll get that kind of thinking sometimes. I'll say, no, we don't want that. Or it's 40%. We don't want a whole bunch of kids suspended, period. We should not be over 10% of that population. So we always think triangulation, which is also intersectional. So we're going to do the absolute, the baseline. Absolute will catch pieces. Baseline catches the other part that's underneath. And then we have to look at school context and the intersectional factors in order to better understand disproportionality. So I have, we had a new principal come in one of our schools, and all of a sudden, all the suspensions went up, and he was totally looking at the policy of dress, and started suspending. But the previous principal was not looking at it that way. He had other stuff that he was doing. There were some challenges around that. But this started raising the suspension space. And the school context was I'm trying to come in here and show my power, try to anchor who I am, trying to make rules happen, because there were issues before around management and behavior and teachers feeling like they could work with certain students. And so the school context caused the disproportionality to go even further. But that's not if you don't have any kind of control in the school, I don't think the clothing is the first thing you have to even be worried about. There's a lot of things around structures and policies and systems. Relationships might be good too. How do we love our kids. And in the literature, the kids, particularly kids of color, don't say, we want you to like you. They say they want you to love them like you would love your own kids or your own nephews or nieces. And what does that environment look like for the kids there? So the context of intersectionality is, I'm going to look at those absolute and baseline spaces, but I want to also look at who's rising up. Why are all these boys of color being over-identified to go into special education? And we know that kids of color don't act any worse than any other child, but they do express themselves differently. They step into space differently. They might talk differently. They may have passionate tones of voice. We know when they raise their voice, they're more likely to be asked to leave the room. We know when they get challenging to teachers, they may be asked to leave the room. We know when they walk physically toward teachers or stand up in classrooms, they may be asked to leave the room. So we have to think about, what does this bring up for us, and how do we help them with appropriate uses of anger or sadness? You can have a kid who, I once was asked to deal with a school where it was a whole issue around African American boys, but I'm in the library walking out with a group of the young men, and I see a boy looking at bomb material on the computer. He's totally quiet. Nobody paid attention to him. I said to the principal, did you see what that young man was looking at? But who gets in trouble? The one who is considered to be loud. We have a lot of words we use about our kids that are disproportional statements as well. They're loud, bad, difficult. They could be a kindergartner. I had an defiant, oppositional, all kinds of language about pushing back. And a lot of kids of color are told, don't let people step to you disrespectfully. They're told that at home. But teachers will say, this is how they're supposed to act, but they often don't. I've had little 3-year-olds being brought in. We need you to help with the ECE classrooms. We're really having problems with ECE. They bring little Keisha in, and she's strong. She's already strong. I don't want this. Don't touch my hair. Already. And the teacher says, Keisha assaulted me, Dr. Sampson. I said, assaulted? Do we say that at home? Don't assault mommy. How do we talk about our kids? What's the language that we use when we see difference? And what will we do to a 3-year-old? Now, you know that's not okay. Now, you're going to sit right there, and you're going to say you're sorry. 3-year-olds might spit on you. I mean, they're learning. They don't have all the language yet. They may do a lot of things, but is it assault? So we have to think about how we talk about it. So that's some of the intersectional and school context factors. So we'll talk about the data. We don't always talk about the school context and the cultural differences, all those intersectional spaces. So it's really important to think about that.
So, I have a mic. So thinking about where disproportionality occurs most in schools, here's some thoughts, and Dr. Sampson hit on some of these ideas of in the classroom, in special ed, but we see it in assessments. We see it in child welfare. We talked a lot about discipline already. Honors and advanced placement courses. We see disproportionality in terms of who is represented in those courses. When we go out into schools and districts and we conduct reviews of those schools, we look at their rates of honors and AP, and it's often skewed very highly towards white students who even know that these AP courses are an opportunity for them. Extracurriculars, the physical environment of schools and classrooms. Skin tone, body size, movement, learning styles. So these are some areas. Is there anything not represented on this list that you all think about when it comes to disproportionality? Anything else that could be included? Yeah.
I think like any pay-to-play activity.
Yeah,
So
that's great. Mm-hmm.
Sports, band.
Yes.
any
Yeah.
pay-to-play activity.
Any pay-to-play activity, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And there comes in the intersections again, right? Of class and race, and sometimes gender. So yeah.
I want to make a comment about disproportionality.
Yeah.
With all the
Yeah.
I've heard some administrators say that, you know, we don't even put the data in the system. Not in terms of kids getting sent home.
Sure.
But even like in-house suspension.
Right.
They don't even put in the system anymore. So we're like in this dangerous place where if we don't have some real conversations around suspension, then the data is going to be skewed that way.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, sometimes data isn't even included in within our tracking systems, and then leadership turns over. What does that mean, right? We don't know. We don't have comprehensive points from which to start. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead.
We don't want principals to be and schools to be vilified because they need help.
Right.
But they have to be able to
right.
ask for it and receive support.
Right.
That's a policy statement at the district level of how we can assist and support. So I don't have to call mom and say, do you want to come get him? And she says yes, and that's not a suspension. So we really have to help to be able to tell the truth that this is happening.
Another place would be like applications for journalism or ASB leadership classes.
Yeah. So leadership classes, applications. Yeah. Anything else that folks can think of? Thank you all for these additions here.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
I want to say that when we look at school contacts and data, we don't often look at some of the different ways that disproportionality happens. So I want you to look at skin tone and body size. We never look at anything like that. But we know that darker skinned girls are suspended across the country disproportionately than lighter skinned girls. We know that more substantial, I don't say fat, I say substantial. Okay. We know that substantially sized students are suspended more than kids that are not. So we never look at all these differences on this level. And it's important, and that's where we start to find some of the spaces that we're not looking at and what's happening, and they're intersectional often. Yeah.
Thank you. So the causes of disproportionality, we've talked through a lot of this. Instruction, curriculum, assessment. We see it in interventions. We see it in the referral process, who gets referred to certain things, who gets left out. We've talked a lot about discipline. We'll go through some of that in our data sets here. In tracking, we see a lot of disproportionality. What populations do get tracked and who gets left out. Teacher expectations and misconceptions. And this is where that ongoing training is so critical, right? That it's not just new employee orientation where some of this culturally responsive practice is talked about and worked on, but it's this ongoing commitment to the work and ongoing commitment to unlearning our own bias and naming our biases even, right? Because that can be really scary for folks of like, well, am I going to be seen in a certain way if I say this, right? So folks often will keep that inside. And then some cultural dissonance. This lack of understanding, this lack of awareness leads a lot of the times to disproportionality. So just to name these pieces as well before we keep going. So.
Okay, so we have 2 seconds left. Let's. We wanted to at least give you a sample of what you might dig for in disproportionality. The scholarly work says we have to look at the intersectional pieces. Consistent data mining, it's like we don't just find it and stop. We have to put a plan of action in to follow and monitor it and backwards plan it. We have to look at the school and community context. We can't do it without looking at curriculum and instruction. What's being taught? I might want to get out of a classroom because your pedagogy is so whack. I don't want to stay. I don't see myself ever. I don't ever have any fun activities. I don't get engaged. Nothing is connected to me. And even if I have to hear about the old, do you connect it to the new? How do you create a space that is energetic? Classrooms are emancipatory, vibrant, flavorful. So a lot of what we look at when we look at suspensions and or just how academically how students are doing, we've got to look at curriculum, instruction. How are people instructing our students? And then the policies and procedures. And the literature says we must look at ourselves. So we look at data, we might look at curriculum, but we often don't look at ourselves in the process or help other people to look at themselves. So I wanted to give you an example of how that looks so that you can take it with you, because we often just look at the smaller pieces. So what I did was I took, made a sample. And this sample is looking at the over discipline of black boys, because I did see some disproportional spaces in some of your data. So I want to give you a sample of what it looked like. When you look at instruction and curriculum, you see the titles there: policies, procedures, professional development, our inside out look, and our intersectional. I want you to just look over that for a minute. And this is something to take to your meeting and say, are we really looking closely at some of these pieces? So these are some of the things you would do for that particular area, although you would use this for lots of different areas. And I'll give you a blank form to take with you that will look at some of your data. Is it on the other side? Yeah. Yeah, we can look at that one, yeah. It's a lot of work to bust disproportionality. It's tiresome. So look at all the things. If we're going to look at the issue, just this one issue. It was sent to us by. Oh, well, maybe I have the wrong. Let me ask Colin. Is that right? Yeah, shoot. Okay. I wonder how to hold it. I'm going to ask her. Thank you. Okay. Okay. So we don't have we have what data we have, and it's just a way for us to practice today, the data we just gave you. So if we go back and look at the next steps plan for black boys, we look at their required resources, the timeline, and who will be responsible. Who's going to be responsible for making sure these areas are because they're pretty intersectional areas, but they are policy and curriculum, and who are all the people? We often don't have all the people in the room. So this is kind of like a cheat sheet about some of the things you would do. So we got to talk about black boys. We have to say their name. I'm literally in places where I'm like, say the word black, it's okay. We got to talk about it, identify who it is, and say we want to love and embrace all our young boys. So what's happening with this particular group? It could be any student issue. Okay. So this is like a template. So this is your template of what you do if you have an issue with black boys. These are some of the things in order to bust disproportionality regarding the issue of African American boys and over discipline. But you might need help and resources. We don't always know how to do all of these things. So when you just, as we look at that, you're going to take your data and can we go to where's the clicker? The next slide. Oh. So we're going to look at your data for Santa Clara, this is just a sample for us to practice on, thinking about all the different things you might have to do. And then you're going to take this data. On the other side of the data, if you turn that over, I made a simple chart for you about what are some of the areas you would do in order to deal with what you're seeing about your suspensions. Knowing that we've talked about school context, the inside out look, going closer to those spaces when we think about the baseline and the other ways of looking at data. When we think about how we have to have conversations that are robust and courageous, it's not just the data. What are some of the things you do? Taking into account that I gave you a sample of what you would have to do around black boys. Just looking at that, what things would you put in the box on the other side of your data that you would do to be able to manage that? And what I want to do is to do it a little differently because you're small groups. If you two would come to this table, and if you two would join this table, and then there's one more person, if you would have three or four, so you three over there could continue, but talk together a little differently about what would be in these boxes regarding this data from Santa Clara. We're not going to take a long time and we'll go over it, but what would you put in those areas that we have to pay attention to and share that knowledge together? Is everybody sure of the directions? It's a lot of information, but some of the ways to think about it. Okay. One person says something? We came all the way out here to see all of you. And she's, that's good. Good comeback. Okay. So you never have enough time with all of these. Like I said, data digs are, I usually work with a data set. And at the end of the day, we have identified the people, the challenge, what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, who's going to be responsible, and how to monitor it. And that's the challenge of coming in a short time frame. But I wanted to just give you the areas that would be so important to think about. And this visual, stay above the waterline, it means that we should be going deep, we have to have disaggregated consciousness as the norm. We'll see aggregate maybe, but the total disaggregated, if I was going to look at Santa Clara County suspensions per 100 students enrolled by race and gender, I have to go down to the class. Who's the teacher who keeps referring? Do I need to give her some support? It can't just be up here 30,000 foot. I need to know how many times that educator send them out. How many times did the academic dean or whoever you call your disciplined people suspend? How many times were these kids from a socioeconomic space that creates more disproportionality? How many times were they foster care kids? How many times was it boys or versus girls? What time of day was it? What content area was it? So we don't often go close enough so that we can help people with what the challenges are. Who was sent to the social worker or psychologist or counselor, and who was sent to the police or security? So these are some of the questions that we sometimes don't ask when we're busting disproportionality. What area of town did these kids come from? Some of our biases just rise up in it, and sometimes it's just how we think about things. And I'm not saying it's you, but these are some of the issues in disproportional spaces. We want to know what grade it is. We want to know their academic proficiency, because half the time we're looking at a behavioral issue that's an academic challenge. You made me read out loud. You know I don't read that well, and so I might as well act totally crazy so I can get out of here. So we have to understand that some of these issues that we create are part of that challenge. In the instructional area, what kind of things can you just throw out that you thought of? We'll go by table because of the microphone. Do you have any instructional areas?
Reviewing curriculum.
Reviewing curriculum, okay. What did you think over here? Nobody wants to take the microphone. It's like, don't look at me. Instructional areas. Do you have something?
You named all the ones that we came up with.
Okay. Let me give it to you. He was telling me gotta stay on microphone. Yeah.
We talked about doing that deeper drill down and making sure that you get granular.
Yeah. Did anybody think about if they're English language learner? So that's important to think about as well. Do you have an instructional area too?
We talked about just looking at the classroom environment, just the routines, right, and practices, or lack of routines and practices, right, and how things are taught, and by whom.
We also need to look at paras and their contribution in the classroom and how they're supporting. Did you have your hand up before? Okay. What about over here? Do you have any instructional areas?
So one of the big areas we were looking at within instruction was within the piece of the intersectionality between the disabilities and the different students of race, and really understanding and helping our general education teachers understand how to use universal design within their classrooms, how to work with students with challenging behaviors, and how to move forward, as well as having our students that do have disabilities to make sure we have quality staff that are working within special education that can support them, and just overall understanding that this is not your child, my child, this is our children, and that we're working together, helping with understanding cultural biases and having training with that regarding our teachers and letting them see that, dive deeply within their own biases and why they're acting this way with their children, why they're pinpointing these specific children in general. So that's the starting point.
Everybody has seen this data set before. So as you go back and think more about it, some areas to push on. And who said all those African American boys do have disabilities? They might not even have. They may be acting out because they've been identified to have, but who are they? And what do they need? And sometimes in schools there's 27 kids, but 15 of them are doing all the high level work. And so what's the intervention, supports, PBIS, whatever interventions you use and supports, what happened with that? Did anybody we'll jump with the individual self. Anything in particular about what you would have to do? Anybody have any? That's often the hard. What are you going to have to do as educators to go closer to look at what this data is telling you about? And then you have Native American students, you don't even have that many. Way disproportionate to their numbers. Why are they rising up? Do we need to bring some elders? Do we need to bring some community people? Do we have to understand more about what needs to be done? How are we treating and thinking about conceptualizing our Native American students? Oh, well, they're quiet. We'll hear the stereotypes, so we don't know what's going on. But at least they're not being disruptive in class. But they still are being pushed out. They're not receiving. It's a civil rights issue in terms of their needs. So we might have to do some serious work about our Native American students and what they need in our district that we're not understanding in terms of teaching. We know from the scholarly work that they must have curriculum that is connected to who they are, plus understanding the curriculum that is basic to schools. I don't see myself, there's no place for me. And nobody sees me as valuable or even thinks I'm gifted. If you look at your gifted stuff, it would be aligned with this as well. They're not there. They're often not there. So any individual, upside down. Any individual, could you share? Anybody? Yes.
Well, one thing I always think is important, I think of teachers as cultural and intellectual workers, and so reading is really essential. And so for example, with the Native American students piece recently, I read a teacher action research project that was about how changing a math curriculum to meet needs of Native American students. But one of the things she did first was she read about what, from Native American communities, what they write about their own communities. Because there's a lot out there that's not from them.
And culturally, that means stepping outside your space and your privilege and saying, I don't know. I don't have a sense. I got to understand. I have to create. Is the curriculum culture responsive already? Hardly ever. You have to add, augment, and make it interesting and vibrant. And those are some of the ways that you can think about it. I'm going to give you two things before Colleen closes out. I was asked to create something for another school district around, we're not specifically talking about black boys today, but they're rising up in your data. And so I want to give you a tool that I sometimes share with schools, which is called African American Boys and Youth Checklist. And it's something to share with schools who are struggling with caring for, understanding, and teaching black boys. So I'll show you how it works. On the first page, you'll see the bullets that say academic. Does anybody know what verb means? Their swag, their flavor, how they walk, their movement, their verbal skills, and the behavior. These are there are about 10 things, but these are the 4 top things that bring them to the attention of discipline or teachers. And so what I did with the boys' checklist, I'll show you how it works. So those are the 4 areas. 2 and 3 are foundational information pages of what we can do in schools. But I want you to go to page 5. So I took the areas, academic, verb, behavior. Then on the left side of the box, I'm on page 5, I gave you some things you have to be concerned about or think about for black boys. The right side is the culturally responsive behavior you could do. And you can share this with your school. So it's just a lot of information. But some schools will sit with this with their discipline team, attendance team, academic team. And I also give you possible interventions for each area. So if we go, when you go all the way through it, it's those 4 areas with different ways to manage, support, think about, care about, teach black boys. Page 7, their verb. Did you know that many African American boys and youth have high verb, which is often misrepresented as hyperactive? Okay. Because their passion, their movement, their stylistic ways, and there is no monolithic group, but there are themes that run across African American boys. I want to say that we know in the literature are really specific to them, but there are some that could be totally outside of this space. So the left, I tell you what's going down. The right, I tell you, here are some things you can do. Okay? So please share this with your schools, and they could start to have a conversation. I often will start with this to have a little conversation about, what do you think about this? And I'll have one group take academic, one take verb, one take behavior, and we'll say, what do you think we should do with this, and how could we help? And they then start placing names. I think about this, and I think about this, and I think about this. Because it's also intersectional with that, because it talks about what we have to do and understand. So it's a good tool to use and to take back as an option. I'm giving you a lot of thinking here, a lot of ideas. Some schools will take it and go through it with a particular black boy in mind, because it also says what we have to do. So it's up to you how you use it, but we have to be aware that it's systemic, still intersectional. Any questions about that? Okay, your last thing of 100,000 pieces of paper is called the Disproportionality Checklist. The Disproportionality Checklist I'm leaving you with is a baby checklist, because I have some high-level hard ones, and a lot of times I just give out the simplistic checklist of what could we look at in our team at school to bust disproportionality. And it goes aligned with some of these areas. And I give you examples. So I've had principals bring it to staff meetings. Let's go over these domains. Let's see how we're doing. Let's see what we need to look at in order to go closer to what's happening in our school. I've had it done in meetings. It's kind of up to you, but it goes through the areas of disproportional. Do you need another one? You had enough? Okay. So that's how it works. I might have one more if we're short. Everybody had one? You didn't. So this is the checklist. To sit in teams and talk through what are we doing, how are we going to do it, what's our plan of action. Just asking questions, identifying challenges, writing down results to come up with your plan of action that should cover a lot of these areas: our inside out, our intersectional, ourselves, the systems and policies, and instruction, curriculum. And I just write it really informal so that the language is just common and you can kind of talk a lot about what we're doing or not doing as close as you want to. Any questions about, that's a lot of information, but I want you to have something you can take away. If you never see my face again, you say, Dr. Sampson did give me something. When she left here, Colleen brought all this information to us, and we can think about some things when we leave here, how to go closer, closer, closer. The last thing I want to say is I developed a disproportionality index for a school district where, in order to bust disproportionality for particular groups of students, the data had to be entered at the end of every week. Principals had a hard time with this. Deans had a hard time with this, to show who was on the radar for disciplinary action. And then the intervention team showed up right after that. You have to have support for schools. A lot of them can't do it inside. You don't have the money. But what could they do inside? They had to put information in this disproportionality index. Any suspension went all the way to the district right away to be reviewed to see if it was appropriate. That's a hard one. People won't like it. It'll be difficult. So I'm going to turn it back to Colleen to close us out. If you have any, we'll stick around a little bit if you have any questions, but we know we gave you a lot, but really want you to take away some pieces that could help you with the looking at the disproportional spaces.
Okay, I'm gonna just use this one. So as we close our time together, we've given you a ton of information in a couple of hours. It's a lot to digest. I know for me, when I leave spaces where I've been engaged in learning, it's important for me to consider what's next and what do I need to continue working on. So here's some questions to consider. What is one way you can use these data mining strategies to infuse culturally responsive practice into the roles that you occupy? What additional data questions do you need answered to better understand the students you serve? You all talked about some folks feel like they're okay with the amount of data they have. Some folks need more. So what's needed at your school, within your district, from the county office to better answer some of these questions? When it comes to equity work generally, where do you get stuck? Where are some of those roadblocks that you experience or have to mitigate? And I know for me, like, I sometimes will think I'm doing, quote unquote, enough, and people will come and say, hey, you didn't think about this. And I can, a quick example, post the rallies in Charlottesville where there were neo-Nazis and white supremacists, protesting. We held a space on campus where we called the event processing, the white supremacy that took place in Charlottesville. And I had a colleague come up to me who was very upset, and they said to me, Colleen, I don't understand why this program doesn't include anti-Semitism, because there was so much anti-Semitism that took place at this event. And for me, I was in this space of, I thought that white supremacy encompassed this and was enough. And for that individual and other individuals, Jewish identified folks on campus, it wasn't enough. and they were very hurt. And it was this ongoing kind of cyclical piece of not being heard, not being validated, not mattering in terms of their identities. It was a really important learning moment for me as I plan events and programs and do this work. Who else do I need to bring into the conversation? Because I obviously don't know it all, right? And so this ongoing piece of like, when we hear these things, when we get this feedback, how do we receive it? And how do we keep moving forward? Who will hold you accountable to the work, right? How do you create space for accountability? Is that something you ask for? It can be really powerful. For us as trainers, it's important for us to get feedback. It's important for us to learn as we grow. We make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes all the time. So finding that accountability partner or partners that can help you with that. And then what additional resources do you need to continue to infuse equity into your practice? And so these are just some things to be thinking about as we close our time together today. So one thing we do want to do, and I'm going to just pass the microphone around and ask if you're comfortable, is to just share a word or a phrase of what you're sitting with right now. What are you thinking about? Or maybe what is a commitment you have? You don't have to answer all three of these, but just what are you sitting with as you close out the time here? So if folks are willing to share, that would be wonderful. So just going to kind of go around, pass the mic around. Is anybody willing to get us started? Thanks. And you just pick which way the mic goes.
So from a selfish standpoint, being a part of the team in-house that's creating the Ways to Equity playbook, I'm leaving energized because we're leaving with some added tools that I think will best serve the state as we move forward with the work. And then it's to piggyback on that, we have colleagues right now that are down at the Equity Institute in Anaheim, and so they've been sending us stuff too. So it's refreshing to hear that equity is on the brain, and that it's not just cocktail conversation at this point.
I'm also helping to develop the playbook, so this was very instructional for me and has really helped me to think about my position, positionality, and how that affects my thinking. So it's nice to have a reminder of that in terms of the work that we're doing, and the tools are great. Thank you.
What you just mentioned was really interesting to me and something that's been on my mind and I'm continuing to think about as I build programs and sort of infuse equity tools into the work that I'm already doing about like who is included and why they are included and how can we be more clear about what seems to others to be exclusion and just the importance of that right now.
I'm sitting with taking all this information in and absorbing it, and how do we facilitate this through the work that we do in our professional development with the staff here at the county office. And what also really stuck with me is the accountability piece, and including that in who's accountable and who's holding others accountable with this work.
I'm feeling resourced.
I've appreciated the time that we've spent to think about these things, reflect, and really feeling affirmed that, yeah, I should continue to facilitate more reflection and really push for that, even though that in many of the places that I go to as a consultant, it's really hard to bring together teachers because they're exhausted, especially in inclusion ECEs. They're exhausted and and the fact that they're not getting paid enough. So just to appreciate that, but to continue, working on that to really, because it's in the reflection that we learn.
I don't have one word. It's just what I'm going to be taking back to my staff and my site, because I am at the intersection of where everything comes and hits the ground. I'm an assistant principal. So right now, kind of overwhelmed, feeling positive. I came up with some ideas of things that I think we can implement at my site that will make a positive difference.
I think I'm going to walk away with the notion of this is work and conversation that needs to continue.
Well, like Erica, I do feel like I have a lot of resources that I'm really excited to share with some of our partners and people that are involved in the Ways to Equity playbook and that really want to do that work at their district. So I feel like I hope that I can really empower them with you know, a lot of the resources that you shared.
Mine's the how. How to really encourage and empower looking at equity needs at the different sites that we serve.
Thank you all. I know for me, something we just talked about in our office on Monday as we were preparing for another training that we're holding is why don't some of our data sets include all these identities that we talk about? And so continuing to ask why and to ask for those numbers, even if they're small, and to make sure, for me, there's an ongoing commitment to make sure that we name who's not present. So do you have one you want to share? No? Okay. All right. So some additional resources that are just on here. These couple books, Hacking School Discipline by Maynard and Weinstein, and Culturally Responsive Education in the Classroom. This is an equity framework for pedagogy from STEMbridge. So these are all posted on the Google Drive, which I wrote the link down here, but I just made it a tiny URL because it's a lot of letters and numbers on Google otherwise. So hopefully make sure that you can access that. And if not, let me know because I will change the settings. I think I set it up. So we really appreciate your time and the work that you all put into being, oh yeah. I wrote it right here too.
You can take a picture of it.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. So I'll hold that for a quick second.
Everything is on there.
Yeah. So this is our contact information and then our center's website. But we are a federal grant and we really rely on feedback from these sessions to help us do our job better. And so this QR code, or we also have some paper copies if you would prefer a paper copy. It's a quick little assessment for us that goes, we contract out evaluators and they help us gather that feedback and give it to us. So we really appreciate your feedback. We appreciate your time and your energy this morning. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll stick around for a little bit. That's our contact info if you need anything moving forward.
So the feedback that they are asking for is different.
It's different.
Than the feedback form that I just gave you, as we too are grant funded.
Yes. So many grants.
We need a collection of both if you'll take that.
Thank you. Yeah.